Before we begin, take a moment to slow down. Relax your shoulders. Unclench your jaw. Let your breathing become natural. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to rush. Just listen. This is a story about the future, about intelligence and about a question humanity is only beginning to understand. So sit back, focus, and let's begin. The Vatican Secret Archives. Documents hidden from humanity. The secrets behind doors locked for centuries. Part 1, the door that was never named correctly. There are some places that become terrifying not because people know what is inside them, but because they do not. A sealed room, a locked corridor, an institution older than nations, and shelves full of paper older than empires. That is how the Vatican's archives entered popular imagination, not as an archive at first, as a rumor. For generations, people have spoken of the Vatican Secret Archives as if they were a forbidden chamber where the Church hid the truths humanity was never meant to see. Lost Gospels, proof against the Bible, letters that could overturn history, records of heresy, kings' betrayals, trials, forbidden sciences, prophecies, maybe even stranger things. The title itself did most of the work. Secret Archives. 3 syllables of institutional darkness, strong enough to make even ordinary shelves feel like a conspiracy. But the first twist in this story is that the famous name was misleading from the very beginning. In 2019, Pope Francis formally changed the institution's name from the Vatican Secret Archive to the Vatican Apostolic Archive, explaining that the old Latin word secretum had long been misunderstood. In the archive's historic title, it did not mean secret in the modern sense of hidden from the world. It meant private, separate, reserved for the Pope's own archive, under his direct jurisdiction. Francis wrote that the term had acquired ambiguous, even negative nuances in modern languages, and that this was the opposite of what the archive had always intended to be. That changes the emotional shape of the entire myth, because suddenly the archive is not a cinematic vault of forbidden truth. It is something older and subtler, a private papal archive that, over time, became misread by a world increasingly attracted to secrecy as spectacle. And yet the correction does not make the place less fascinating. It makes it more dangerous in a different way. Because if the archive is not a fantasy dungeon of hidden revelations, then what is it? It is history under concentrated custody. The official Vatican archive site says the documentary heritage preserved spans about 12 centuries, from the 8th to the 20th centuries, and is organized into over 600 archival funds distributed across more than 85 linear kilometers of shelving, including space in an underground bunker below the Vatican museums. The same official description notes that Pope Leo Roman XIII opened the archive to scholars in 1881, after which it became one of the world's great centers for historical research. 85 kilometers of shelving. Pause there for a moment and let that number do its work. Not one locked room, not one iron chest, not one hidden drawer containing the answer to everything, but a continent of paper, diplomacy, trials, letters, petitions, statecraft, church governance, pleas from queens, kings, bishops, nobles, prisoners, scientists, heretics, and men who believed Rome might change their fate with one reply. That is what makes the Vatican archive feel so cinematic. It does not merely contain documents. It contains accumulated human gravity, the pressure of centuries of people writing toward power. I imagine the first generations of clerks who handled such paper, wax seals, parchment, ink drying in rooms lit by daylight and candles. Messengers are arriving from kingdoms that no longer exist, letters crossing mountains and seas toward the same center. Empires rose and fell outside. Wars changed borders. Dynasties ended. But the paper kept coming. That continuity matters. Pope Francis's 2019 letter says the archive grew from the documentary nucleus of the Apostolic Chamber and Apostolic Library between the first and second decade of the 17th century, becoming more formally defined around 1610-1612 under Pope Paul V. He also notes that even before the famous 1881 opening to researchers from every country, scholars had long obtained authentic copies and used the archive for serious historical work. In other words, this was never a pure legend space. It was a working engine of institutional memory. And yet, for centuries, access was restricted enough to let myth breed. That is the second twist of the story. The archive is not secret in the Hollywood sense, but it was also not casually open. For a long time, ordinary outsiders could not simply walk in and browse through papal correspondence as though it were a public library. According to the official Vatican description and other historical accounts, scholars did not gain formal, broad access until 1881, when Leo Roman XIII opened the archive to researchers. That decision mattered enormously because it transformed the archive from a symbol of ecclesiastical custody into a battlefield of modern historical interpretation. And you can feel why the Church would have been cautious. Because archives do not preserve only glory. They preserve embarrassment, contradiction, misjudgment, political maneuvering, silences, things written in confidence that become dangerous in hindsight. Any institution that survives long enough to accumulate 12 centuries of record will also accumulate 12 centuries of vulnerability. That is why the fantasy of documents hidden from humanity has always found fertile ground here. Not because the archive is full of one single explosive truth, but because a structure like this necessarily contains countless partial truths about power, compromise, doctrine, fear, diplomacy, and the uneasy marriage between spiritual authority and worldly history. And the archive's known treasures are already enough to ignite the imagination without inventing anything supernatural. Public reporting and exhibition materials connected to the archive have long highlighted famous documents such as Henry Roman VIII's 1530 petition for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, documents related to Galileo's trial, the 1521 papal bull excommunicating Martin Luther, and letters tied to figures like Mary, Queen of Scots. In 2012, the exhibition Lux in Arcana displayed a selection of major documents from the archive, emphasizing that these holdings span centuries of world history, not just internal church paperwork. That list alone tells you what kind of place this is. The English Reformation, the Galileo affair, the Protestant break with Rome, Queen's writing under sentence of death. This is not a room of abstract theology only. It is a vault of collisions. History enters the archive at the exact point where belief, science, monarchy, law, and fear stop agreeing with one another. And that is why people always want one more locked drawer. Because if the publicly known documents are discharged, what else might still be waiting in the stacks? The honest answer is more interesting than either blind suspicion or blind dismissal. A great deal is not hidden in the apocalyptic sense at all. The archive is open to qualified scholars, not to the general public as a tourist attraction. The Vatican's own statements emphasize service to scholarship and culture. Francis wrote explicitly that the Church is not afraid of history and that the archive's mission is to serve the Church in the world of culture. The Vatican Archive site describes it today as one of the most famous historical research centers in the world. But that does not mean everything is instantly available. The archive is open in layers, often by pontificate, and the Pope decides when later periods are released for consultation. The official Vatican notice from 2019-2020 states that documents from the pontificate of Pius Roman XII 1939-1958 were open to scholars on 2 March 2020. A Vatican newsletter on that opening explains that each papal era has historically been released gradually over time, with later pontificates becoming accessible only by papal decision. That is where the modern tension really lives. Not in a fantasy claim that the entire archive is sealed from humanity, but in the fact that time itself was curated. A century opens, a later decade stays closed. A pontificate becomes researchable, a more recent one remains in shadow. This creates the feeling, not entirely unjustified, that history inside the Vatican does not simply age into public knowledge on its own. It is released by authority, in stages, under rules, and with institutional control still very much intact. That alone is enough to keep mystery alive. Now picture the archive not as a conspiracy vault, but as a physical atmosphere. Long corridors, bound registers, shelves disappearing into controlled darkness, folders that have not been unfolded in generations. A researcher receiving one box after another, knowing that each one may contain something historians have mentioned for a century or something almost no one has read carefully in modern times. This is where the narration deepens, because the archive's power comes not only from what it contains, but from what it does to scale. Once you realize that the Vatican has preserved centuries of correspondence from popes, nuncios, tribunals, congregations, and diplomatic channels, you stop asking childish questions like are there aliens in the basement, and start asking harder ones. How much of Europe's political memory passed through these shelves? How many wars, excommunications, reconciliations, censures, and pleas are still traceable through paper here? How often did religion and statecraft become impossible to separate inside these files? And then there is Napoleon, because even archives can become spoils of empire. The history of the Vatican Archives includes one of the great episodes of documentary plunder in modern Europe. During the Napoleonic era, huge portions of the archive were transferred to Paris and only later returned, incompletely. Standard historical accounts of the archive describe the transfer of thousands of crates to France and the fact that not everything came back. That matters because it reminds us of something essential. Whoever controls memory controls part of power. That sentence belongs at the center of the whole story. Whoever controls memory controls part of power. And the Vatican understood that early. Not just spiritually, administratively, politically, civilizationally. That is why the archive was never merely a warehouse. It was an organ of continuity, a way for an institution older than most states to keep track of itself, defend itself, interpret itself, and, when necessary, respond to challenges armed not only with doctrine but with records. And this is where the title question begins to sharpen. Are these really documents hidden from humanity? The answer, at least in the strongest historical sense, is not exactly. Many of the archive's holdings are known, catalogued, studied, and in principle available to qualified scholars. The institution has been open to serious researches since 1881. Its scale and structure are publicly described, and even its most famous secret label has officially been reframed because it was misleading in modern language. But the myth survives because another answer is also true. Control remains. Access is filtered. Chronology matters. Not every archive of the Holy See is the same archive. Not every modern file is open, and the public imagination will always rush faster than an archival procedure. That is why the Vatican Archive has never needed a supernatural secret to remain fascinating. The real drama is already there, a 12th century memory machine, a sovereign religious institution. Documents powerful enough to reshape how historians understand kingdoms, crises, and doctrine, and doors that open, but only in the language and rhythm chosen by the custodians themselves. So part 1 ends not with proof of some hidden anti-humanity revelation, but with the more compelling image, a corridor under Vatican authority. Shelves running for miles, a document box carried to a desk, a historian opening a file older than their nation, and all around that moment, the lingering suspicion that the world does not fear the Vatican Archive because it is empty of truth, but because it may contain too much of it at once. Part 2, what is actually hidden, and why the locked doors still matter. The most powerful secrets are not always the ones no one can access. Sometimes they are the ones people can access only slowly, partially, and under the supervision of time. That is the real atmosphere of the Vatican Archive. The modern myth says there are doors that have been locked for centuries because the documents behind them would shatter religion, destroy the church, or reveal the truth about everything from extraterrestrials to apocalyptic prophecies. But once you strip away the fever dream, the real structure that remains is almost more unnerving, a massive archive that is partly open, partly delayed, partly dispersed, and still governed by the logic of an institution that sees memory not as a public free-for-all, but as a responsibility held under authority. That distinction matters, because the Vatican Apostolic Archive is not the only archive in the Vatican world. The 2020 Vatican newsletter on the opening of Pius Roman 12 era materials makes clear that archival research relating to the Holy See can involve multiple historical archives across different dicasteries and offices, including the Secretariat of State, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, the Congregation for Oriental Churches, the Fabric of St. Peter, and others. In other words, the public image of one giant room containing every secret is already false at the structural level. The Vatican's memory is distributed. That makes the phrase the Vatican Secret Archives both too simple and too seductive. It suggests one forbidden vault. What really exists is closer to an archival ecosystem. Some papers lie in the Apostolic Archive. Some belong to other historical archives. Some have already been opened. Some remain tied to more recent pontificates, privacy concerns, or institutional rules. This does not make the mystery disappear. It makes it harder to dramatize cheaply. And yet cheap dramatization is exactly what the archive has attracted for generations. Theories thrive wherever three things meet: great age, great authority, and partial access. The Vatican Archive is all three. It is ancient enough to feel mythic, powerful enough to feel dangerous, and open enough to tempt, while still closed enough to frustrate. That is a perfect recipe for legend. So let us ask the question directly: what is actually hidden? The strongest factual answer is not the truth about aliens, the real life of Christ, or documents proving the Bible false. None of those claims are supported by the actual archival record as described by serious scholarship or the Vatican's own public materials. What is hidden in the more ordinary, modern sense tends to be recent, sensitive, private, or not yet opened by pontificate, rather than some single world-ending revelation. The archive's official and semi-official communications repeatedly stress historical research, staged openings, and the careful preparation of fonts, rather than cinematic concealment. But the public does not obsess over ordinary archival procedure. It obsesses over the possibility that procedure itself is a shield. And this is where the Pius Roman XII era becomes so important. For decades, one of the most charged questions surrounding the Vatican Archives concerned Pope Pius Roman XII and the Vatican's conduct during the Second World War and the Holocaust. The opening of those records in March 2020 was therefore a major historical moment, not because it promised instant moral clarity, but because it expanded the documentary field scholars could examine. The Vatican's own announcements described this opening as substantial, involving roughly 120 archives and archival fonts and around 20,000 archival units tied to Paisley's pontificate. That is what real archival drama looks like. Not a door opening onto prophecy scrolls, a door opening onto ambiguity. Because serious historical archives rarely behave like thriller movies. They do not produce one sheet of paper that solves everything. They produce a flood of context, contradiction, bureaucracy, correspondence, and institutional traces that historians have to reconstruct slowly. The Vatican itself framed the 2020 opening in exactly those terms, as a scholarly event prepared over time with research paths, inventories, and documentary resources. But ambiguity can be more dangerous than certainty, especially for an institution built on authority. A document can embarrass without destroying. A correspondence trail can complicate centered diplomacy or moral self-understanding without blowing the whole structure apart. That is why archives matter so much to institutions that survive centuries. They do not merely preserve triumph, they preserve the exact texture of how decisions were made when the future was not yet known. And that is the Vatican Archive's true tension with the modern world. The modern world wants revelation. Archives offer sediment. The modern imagination wants one forbidden manuscript. Real archival power lies in thousands of letters, minutes, reports, petitions, annotations, and absences read together. That is slower, less cinematic, and ultimately more destabilizing. Because one scandal can be denied, a documentary pattern is much harder to silence. This is why even the ordinary rules of access feel charged. Qualified scholars must apply, justify their project, and work within institutional conditions. The archive is not a public museum where anyone walks in from the street and wanders among shelves. Even friendly descriptions of access emphasize that it is a research archive, not a tourist site. That filtered openness is historically normal for archives of this kind, but when the institution in question is the Vatican, every ordinary rule acquires an aura of mystery. And now the paradox sharpens. The archive is famous because it is not entirely closed. If it were totally inaccessible, it would become pure myth. If it were fully public, like a casual reading room, much of the myth would die. Instead, it lives in the middle, open enough to prove that real historical treasure exists, controlled enough to keep the aura intact, fast enough to overwhelm anyone who tries to reduce it to one grand theory. That is why the Vatican Archive has endured so powerfully in culture. It is not just a place, it is a structure that invites projection. Conspiracy-minded people project total concealment. Defenders project scholarly normality. Truth lies somewhere more complicated. A real, enormous, historically invaluable archive that is open in meaningful ways, but still governed by chronology, qualification, institutional custodianship, and the rhythms of papal decision. Even the phrase hidden from humanity becomes more interesting when you look at it closely. Humanity, in the abstract, does not have direct access. but historians, researchers, and specialists often do. The archive's famous holdings have already entered public knowledge through scholarship, exhibitions, reproductions, and cataloguing. The Vatican itself has showcased parts of its holdings publicly, as in the 2012 Lexan Arcana exhibition, where selected documents were displayed to reveal the range of material preserved there. So the real divide is not between the Church and all of humanity. It is between mythic public desire for total access and the archive's actual identity as a controlled scholarly institution. And yet, the locked doors still matter, because every archive reveals priorities through what it opens, when it opens, and how it frames what researchers may see. Delay is not neutral. Selection is not neutral. Preparation is not neutral. Even when justified by conservation, privacy, cataloguing, or administrative order, these choices shape the pace at which history enters public judgment. That is especially important in a place like the Vatican, where the institution holding the documents is also one of the historical actors documented inside them. And here lies the deepest unease of all. The Vatican archive is both memory and self-memory. It preserves the history of the Church, but it does so under the Church's own custody. That does not invalidate the archive, but it gives the entire institution a reflective intensity few archives possess. The keeper of the documents is also, very often, one of the protagonists in the documents. That is why critics keep asking harder questions than what is in there. They ask, who decides when history becomes available? Who frames the meaning of an opening? What remains dispersed elsewhere? What kinds of documentary silence are produced not by conspiracy, but by structure? These are mature questions, and they are more powerful than the childish ones. Because the real danger of an archive like this is not that it hides a single sentence capable of destroying civilization. It is that it controls, to some extent, the velocity of historical truth. Now imagine the archive in the quiet hours after the researchers leave. No dramatic music. No cardinal sweeping through candlelit corridors with forbidden keys. Just climate-controlled rooms. Catalogues. Shelves. Boxes. Documents waiting longer than human careers. And this may be the most haunting part of all. The archive does not need to lie to dominate imagination. It only needs to outlast us. Most political scandals burn brightly and vanish in a generation. The Vatican archive moves on a different scale. A scholar spends 20 years on one pontificate. The archive has held 12 centuries already. This imbalance creates a particular kind of awe. Anyone confronting the archive is not really confronting one institution's paperwork. They are confronting the fact that organized memory, when preserved long enough, becomes almost geological, and that is why the myth of humanity hidden documents will probably never die completely, because the archive is large enough to keep disappointing fantasy and feeding it at the same time. No, it is not the cartoon vault of world-ending revelations. Yes, it does preserve historically explosive materials. No, it is not simply sealed shut forever. Yes, access remains structured, qualified, and complete in ways that keep curiosity alive. So the final answer to the title is not a clean yes or no. Are there documents hidden from humanity? Not in the simplistic sense people usually mean. But are there documents still withheld from general access, distributed across controlled archival systems, released gradually, and bound up with the priorities of one of history's oldest surviving institutions? Absolutely. And that is enough. Enough for the locked doors to matter. Enough for the imagination to keep working. Enough for every generation to wonder whether the next opening will illuminate a saint, a scandal, a war, a silence, or simply another mountain of paper that makes history more complicated instead of less. That is why the story works so well in voiceover. Because in the end, the Vatican archive is not frightening because it contains monsters. It is frightening because it contains record. And record, when preserved across centuries, becomes a rival to myth itself. Behind those doors are not necessarily the secrets people dream about. What waits there is often more unsettling. The slow paper trail of how power spoke, judged, negotiated, hesitated, punished, concealed, explained, and remembered. Not the hidden apocalypse, a documented one. And perhaps that is the most honest final image a scholar at a desk. Gloves off, Pencil ready. One file opened. A seal broken long ago, but not yet understood. And somewhere beyond the next folio, not the end of religion, not the end of history, but something far harder to live with, the possibility that the Church's deepest secret was never one forbidden text, but the sheer scale of what memory becomes when an institution survives long enough to archive almost everything.